Hello, everyone. This is the morning of October 20th, and I assume that most of you, if not all, were on the recording last night when we had internet problems. And so I'm re-recording everything today and hope that you will be able to come and watch the recording. When I did this last night, I talked through everything very fast. This morning, we will slow down a bit and go with pace. So we're doing Women of the Pauline Churches, Patrons, Teachers, and Apostles. And we're going to look at how some of these women fulfilled those roles. Prisca, Lydia, Nympha, Phoebe, and Junia, and the other women of Romans 16. And I think I threw in a few others besides that. But we also have to look at the problem texts, beginning with 1 Corinthians 11 and 14, and then quickly at 1 Timothy and 1 Peter. So, beginning with the problem text. First of all, in 1 Corinthians 11, the issue about head covering, and I tend to think of that as Paul in culture shock. And then 1 Corinthians 14, when we have women who should keep silent in the church, and we have a problem there with the manuscript. Then 1 Timothy and also 1 Peter, which I didn't put in this list, where women can't teach or have authority over men. And then there are the so-called household codes in Ephesians and Colossians with wives subordinate to their husbands. We looked at that, if you remember, the first time that we were together. So we won't go back on that. My interpretation there, and it's not only mine, is that in that whole household code that actually, I don't think they come from Paul himself, the historical Paul, but they're in the Pauline tradition. And then actually in context, they're quite progressive in the way that they look at, they look from both sides to the superior and the subordinate in each case, and humanize the relationship. So 1 Corinthians 11, here's what the text says. First, Paul is saying, I'm happy about everything that you do, which he isn't really, because if you read through the whole letter, there are all kinds of problems with the Corinthians. And one of the things I like to think is that, Paul's letter to the Galatians, everything is about freedom. Christ has set you free for freedom, and so don't fall back into a yoke of slavery. And that the Corinthians got hold of his letter to the Galatians with all this talk about freedom, and they ran with it, because the Corinthians seem quite free. They don't have any problem with freedom. And here it seems as if the women in the community, some of them at least, are pushing the envelope, as we would say, on social customs among them of women having their head covered in public. And that is kind of a culture shock for Paul to see this, and that maybe these women got their ideas from Roman women. Well, look at that. But he says, I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband the head of his wife, and God the head of Christ. The word is kephale, which in Greek carries the same word play that it does in English. You can talk about your head, or you can say the head of my school is, the head of my department is. In other words, a person to whom you're accountable. And that play is going on here, because in that statement at the beginning, obviously, it's talking about the person to whom you're accountable. And so it's not a four-tiered thing, God, Christ, man, woman. It's three relationships of two each, in which there is one is accountable or subordinate to the other. So God and Christ. Christ is subordinate to God. We're not into Trinitarian theology here. And then the man who is the authority in the relationship with the woman is also accountable to Christ. So in each case, there's there's a relationship, a mutual relationship there. And I think, again, it mirrors the culture. I don't think they would have thought that there was anything unusual about that in terms of the broader structure of family life and gender relations. Any man who prays or prophesies with his head covered brings shame upon his head. This is honor shame language here. And with his head covered, his body head, brings shame upon his head, Christ, or his head, his own head. It's ambiguous. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled brings shame upon her head, shame upon her husband, shame upon her male relatives, or shame upon her own head. It's the same thing. And then he gets sarcastic if she had had her head shaved or her hair cut off. But if a woman doesn't have her head veiled, she might as well cut off her hair. It's shameful for a woman to have her hair cut or shaved. And there is, in some cultures, the shaming ritual, of shaving hair off. Then she should wear a veil. On the other hand, a man shouldn't cover his head because he's the image and glory of God, and that has spawned all kinds of theological speculations. It does not seem to be that woman is the image and glory of God, but rather of the man. Evoking the story from Genesis. Man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Man was not created for a woman, but woman for man. And then he's going to go on, and we're about to move to another slide. But before we do, I want to point out in the third sentence there, any woman who prays or prophesies. Women are praying and prophesying. There are women prophets in the community in Corinth. And Paul is not questioning their authority to prophesy. It's just a question of what they wear. So let's move on in this passage. For this reason, a woman should have a sign of authority on her head because of the angels. And the word there is exousia, which means authority in a number of contexts. It's the word that's used in the Gospels when Jesus speaks with authority, not like the scribes. So but because of the angels, if anybody tells you they know exactly what this means, they're making it up. Nobody knows exactly what Paul is talking about here because of the angels. Some speculate about a myth in Genesis about giants copulating with human women. We just don't know. It was some mythic element that both Paul and the Corinthians knew, and we don't. So, nevertheless, you see, he realizes kind of that he's argued himself into a corner. And so he says, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman in the Lord. Just as woman came from man, so man is born of woman, and all things are from God. So actually, he says, it all kind of works out in the end. But then he goes back to his argument, judge for yourself. Is it proper? And actually that translation is not good. Is it honorable, for a woman to pray to God with her head unveiled? Doesn't nature itself teach you? A man wears his hair long, it's shameful. Whereas if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. You have to realize that in context, when he talks about men with short hair, he's talking about shoulder length, not really short. But women having long hair is the custom. Now, the word for nature is not physis. Physis is used in a variety of contexts in the contemporary literature, and it can mean really anything that an author wants it to mean. It really comes more to what's proper. I mean, what people have a sense of is proper. This is not a philosophical discourse on nature, But at the end, he just says, if anybody isn't convinced, we just don't do it that way. That's all. So ultimately, he lands on an argument from authority. Now, a couple of pictures of contemporary women. Here's Pakia Helpus, who's she's a freed woman, and she died at the age of 30, and is commemorated together by her patron, her former slaveholder, and her husband, who are two different people. No veil. She's got braids coming down the side of her shoulders, but no veil. Here are examples of first century hairstyles on elite Roman women, some of them quite elaborate, no veils. But here is the Empress Livia dressed in her stola. The stola is the dress of a Roman matron. It's this thing that winds all around you and goes over the head. You see, she's got it up over her head, with plenty of room to show her curls, her hairstyle, but it's over her head. And on the right side is Sabina, also an elite woman, empress, wife of the Emperor Hadrian, same thing. So you get the idea that in a formal portraiture, they could go without the head coverings, but when they're really in official positions, they do it. It's the traditional thing. Here are two patronesses, not empresses, but important patronesses. Eumachia, who is known at Pompeii on the left side, same thing. She's wearing her stola and it comes up over her head. And Plancia Magna was a very well-known civic patron at Perga in Asia Minor, in southern Asia Minor, again, wearing her stola and the same thing. It comes up over her head. So there is something, we try to get a sense of what would have been expected. And key to this whole question, you see, is the assembly meeting, presumably in a house church in Corinth, is that understood as public or private? Because the rules are different. And the argument has been made that Paul's whole argument there is, this is a public occasion, that there's some sense of public here and not private, and that comes into it too. So it's complicated. Finally, all of that is from the West, from Rome, from Italy, and this is not. This is from the East, from Antioch in Syria, and it's a funerary monument to one or both of the men who are they're reclining on a couch in a formal banquet. It was, again, customary in traditional contexts, more traditional contexts, for women not to recline but to sit, which is what this woman is doing. There's a child in the middle, you see. And this, look at her, she's got a veil up over her head. She's in a position of mourning. That gesture of the hand up to the throat that's a position of mourning. So again, you see that the veil is a customary thing. Now, many of you, I think, are old enough, and I am too, to remember the custom of going to church and having this little lace doily that we had to put on top of our heads. That's a remnant of that whole tradition, and of women wearing something on their heads in church. And in many cultures, and certainly many cultures of the East, and in Islamic cultures, you know that there is still this custom of veiling, and it goes a long way. So using Paul's text as an authority now for veiling seems pretty odd, pretty outdated, but in cultural situations where that's customary anyway, maybe it makes sense. Oh, I did have one more, yes. This is a family portrait. It's in the Vatican Museum, actually. The two the parents were both slaves and both manumitted from different slave owners. And their child over there on the left, Servilius, who also died, unfortunately, he's freeborn. So we have a family portrait there with one child. And again, simply the woman puts her stola up over her head for her formal portrait. But this is the imperial family. This is Augustus and Livia. Augustus in the middle, the man in the middle, Olivia, behind him, and one of their adopted children. And everybody's veiled here, even the man, because it's customary for sacrifice. which is something that's in Roman religion, and Paul certainly does not recommend that and doesn't recognize it, and says that men shouldn't have their head covered, but sometimes they did. So enough for head coverings. In 1 Corinthians 14, we also have this text, and the context is everything should be in good order. And Paul is talking about the gift of prophecy and the gift of tongues, which they had in the Corinthian community. And he says tongues is a wonderful gift, but only if there's somebody to interpret, whereas prophecy is directly comprehensible. So everything should be in good order. And then we get this passage. As in all the churches of the holy ones, women should keep silent in the churches, for they're not allowed to speak, but should be subordinate, even as the law says. No one has been able to identify such a law. We don't know what Paul is referring to when he says, as the law says. But if they want to learn anything, they should ask their husbands at home. It's shameful, for a woman to speak in the church. It sounds like he's seeing the assembly as a public situation in which women are not supposed to be heard in public, even though there are all kinds of exceptions to that. But this is, the social theory. Did the word of God go forth from you, or has it come to you alone? If anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual person, he should recognize that what I'm writing to you is a commandment of the Lord. That last part, you see, it probably doesn't apply just to this passage, but to the whole argument that he's making in the chapter. So really, it's just those two lines of women keep silent in the churches. If they want to learn anything, they should ask at home. There are some good manuscripts in which those two verses are placed at the end of the chapter rather than in the middle of it where this is. And the argument there is that there was manuscript uncertainty. The copyists weren't sure that really was originally there. And so an argument can be made that it wasn't, that this is an insertion into the chapter that Paul himself did not actually write. Be that as it may, it's still there for us. It's there in the canonical text, and so it has to be reckoned with. And I do think it has to do with this sense of public decorum. And it seems as if the Corinthian women, particularly the Corinthian women prophets, are speaking in public, and they are not abiding by the usual rules. So quickly, 1 Timothy 2, and this is where the author, and it's not the historical Paul, we're pretty sure about that, it's someone else later writing in the Pauline tradition, that men should pray lifting up holy hands. This is the gesture of prayer, you see it, and it's duplicated now with the gesture of the priest at Mass turning them this way. That this is the position of prayer. And women should not adorn themselves with braids and gold and pearls. That is stock criticism of women. You see that really often in philosophical discourse. Women shouldn't wear gold and pearls and jewelry and braid their hair, simple hairstyles, not like the ones that you saw earlier. That is straight domestic philosophy for virtuous women. But rather, they should be adorned with good deeds. Now, a woman should receive instruction silently and in submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over man, but to be silent. Why? Because Adam was formed first, and then Eve, and then the woman, Eve, was the one who got Adam into trouble. So the argument again from creation, the order of creation in Genesis, and now what is added is this thing about blaming Eve, and which echoes through the generations. but she will be saved through motherhood, through childbearing, provided women persevere in faith, love, and holiness and self-control. Self-control is one of the virtues, domestic virtues. And this is often pointed out as one of the direct contradictions with the historical Paul, because in 1 Corinthians 7, he spends a whole chapter arguing that, yeah, you can get married if you want, but I really think it'd be better if you didn't because of the coming eschatological crisis. And here, the author here and elsewhere is saying he wants women to marry and bear children. So, yeah, this passage, unfortunately, is one of those that has borne a lot of authority. And as I always say, the problem is not the text, the problem is what we do with it. This women not teaching or having authority over man, as you may know, is literally interpreted in many Christian contexts. The whole idea of women being silent is it's one of these things about women. It's much broader than Christianity. It's there in the whole culture, the ideal of women being silent, even though it doesn't happen that way often. So one other text that I want to add here is from 1 Peter. And it's part of an incomplete household code. There in 1 Peter, well, in Ephesians 5, if you remember, there's a whole discourse about the husband-wife relationship, which moves into the imagery of the church, of Christ and the church. In 1 Peter, just before this, in chapter 2, there's a whole reflection that moves from what's said about slaves, that if you are enslaved and you are suffering unjustly, remember that Christ also suffered unjustly. It's quite an impressive thing, addressed to people who were enslaved and couldn't do anything about it. But then he goes on to say, wives, be subordinate to your husbands, so that even if some disobey the word, which is a bad translation, if they don't obey the word, because what it means is non-believers, people who are not husbands who are not believers. Wives are Christian, husbands are not. This is a little insight into family relationships going on here, that women could accept baptism and belonging in the community, even if their husbands didn't. And there's a lot more could be said about that. So when they see your reverent and chaste behavior, they will be persuaded. So no braiding of hair, no gold and jewelry and fine clothes, but rather good, virtuous life. Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. There's no explicit text that says that, but the allusion to Sarah, the relationship of Sarah and Abraham, again, is a good founding in biblical tradition. Likewise, you husbands, live with your wives in understanding, showing honor to the weaker sex. Where have we heard that before? Since we are joint heirs of the gift of life. Okay, so there's a real mutuality there within a context of subordination, which is something that's part of the culture. So the double message, women are getting this message about what's virtuous, being silent, not wearing jewelry, not braiding your hair, living a very virtuous, honorable life in subordination. And at the same time, we know that there are women who are exercising leadership, civic leadership, social leadership, economic leadership, and leadership in the church. So how do they reconcile that? Well, I think they had to live with it. They had to live with this double message. Just as in many situations, we get a message of what's supposed to be, and then we know that that's not the way it is, and we have to live with it. And I think that's what happened with them. 1 Corinthians 12:28 is a very interesting statement. God has established in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, and then all kinds of other spiritual gifts. So when you read that, when you hear that, what do you imagine? Do you imagine a mixed group, men and women, or do you imagine only men? Ephesians says that the church is built on the apostles and prophets. What do you imagine? We've seen already that there are women prophets here. We're going to see that there are women apostles and teachers, of course, too. So there's gender inclusivity is important in our imagining as well as elsewhere. So let's look at Prisca, who is the wife of Aquila, Prisca and Aquila. It Acts, several times in Acts they are mentioned, and then Paul himself mentions them. It says at Corinth, Paul met a Jew named Aquila, who's a native of Pontus, and the red arrow there shows you where Pontus is. It's North Asia Minor. It's North Turkey today on the Black Sea. So he's an immigrant, and I guess his wife too. It didn't say where she's from. He has recently come from Italy with his wife, Priscilla. And Priscilla is a nickname, a diminutive of Prisca, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So he's from Pontus, but he'd come from Rome to Corinth. These people move around, probably for business. And it says elsewhere, you know, that they like Paul had the skill of and the trade of leather work. We translate that tent making. Well, tents were made of leather, and it's leather work of any kind, belts, shoes, whatever. This is not Prisca and Aquila, but this lovely couple, you've probably seen this picture before. His name is Pacius Proculus, and we don't know her name. They had their portrait painted on their wall in a house in Pompeii, which of course was destroyed, and we don't know what happened to them. But it's a lovely portrait of a couple, and you could perhaps imagine them thinking about Prisca and Aquila. Both of them illiterate, and they're giving the evidence of that. He's holding a scroll, she's holding a stylus in her mouth, up to her mouth in her hand, and a wooden tablet on which you put wax, and then you scratched into it. So both of them have their signs of literacy with them. So Acts goes on. Paul remained in Corinth for some time, and he sailed for Syria together with Priscilla and Aquila. Sailed to Syria, which really means probably to Ephesus, which was the major seaport. And then a little later, there's this mysterious figure named Apollos, he's an Egyptian. He's from Alexandria. And he's a member of the church, and he is speaking boldly. He's preaching in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way more accurately. The way is what they called themselves. It's the church. And you have in Acts 11 that it was in Antioch that they were first called Christians. That wasn't the usual name. They called themselves the way. And so Priscilla and Aquila, this husband-wife ministry team, took Apollos aside and instructed him more accurately, which probably means they instructed him in the way Paul saw the way, because they were collaborators with him. And then Paul twice actually, and then you have 2 Timothy. Paul twice refers to them. He's writing to Romans, and Prisca and Aquila are back in Rome again. They really moved around. Greet them, my co-workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life. We do not know what that story is, and we would love to know. They took risks for Paul, to whom not only I am grateful, but all the churches of the Gentiles, of the nations. There's a story there, and we don't know what it is. And then in 1 Corinthians 16, he's writing from Ephesus. This is earlier. I should have reversed that order. This is earlier than Romans. The churches of Asia, that's the west coast of Turkey, Asia Minor. Send you greetings, Aquila and Prisca, together with the church at their house. So at that point, they have a house church in Ephesus. And then in 2 Timothy, there's a reference as well. But this would be another author putting in these kinds of references to make it really sound like Paul. So there's 6 references to Prisca or Priscilla. In 4 of them, her name is first. And this is very interesting because it's not the custom. So 2 suggestions have been offered for that. We don't really know why. The first is that she was of higher social status than Aquila, which is possible, and that could be the reason. The other is that that Paul knew her better, really loved her, really wanted to give attention to her. We don't know the answer, but it's unusual. Let's look at Lydia at Philippi. In Acts 16, Paul and Silas arrive in Philippi, which is in Macedonia. That's the red arrow that points up. And the reason I put the arrow on Lydia, on the place Lydia, is that you see there is a whole region called Lydia. So in other words, her name is the name of a region. And she's from Thyatira, which is in the north part of Lydia, geographically. But now she's in Philippi, which is quite a distance away. So we went out on the Sabbath to the gate along the river. We thought there'd be a place of prayer, and we spoke to the women who had gathered there. There's no explanation for why this group is only women. One of them is Lydia, who's a dealer in purple cloth from Thyatira. She's a worshiper of God, and it's an expression there that we think means non-Jews who are attracted to Judaism. They attend synagogue worship, which was open, and are attracted to the law, to the moral law, to the ethical standards, to the belief in one God, etc. And it seems that she's one of those. She listened, and the Lord opened her heart, and after she and her household had been baptized, it's a big leap there. So it implies that her household, her house, she's the head of the household, may have been there along the river. And this purple cloth industry, it required a lot of water to rinse the dye, and it would pollute the river, but they didn't think of those things in those days. It could very well be that her business is at her house, which is nearby, and it's located there because of the river. She and her whole household were baptized. Not a whole lot of time for catechetical instruction here. And she said, if you consider me a believer, just come and stay at my home. And so she gave them hospitality. Then there is a whole series of adventures that Paul and Silas have, and they wind up in jail overnight, and they're miraculously delivered from the jail, and they convert the whole household of the jailer. Middle of the night, they're all baptized, and then they're asked to leave town because they're stirring up too much trouble. And before they leave, at the end of the chapter, when they'd come out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they saw and encouraged the brothers and sisters, and then they left. It's the story of a founding of a house church, of Christianity in a city where it hadn't been before. The trouble is that when you get to the letter to the Philippians, Paul never mentions Lydia. We wonder about that. Had she moved on by that time? Had she died so much earlier? We don't know. The possibility is that She's not a historical person that acts. Luke has great stories in Acts, and we don't always know how historical they are. So there's that possibility. But even so, even if she's not a historical person, the story tells us about the founding of the church in Philippi. Also at Philippi, there are other two women, Evodia and Syntyche. The whole of Paul's letter to the Philippians is to appeal to them to get along with each other, to live in harmony. There's something wrong there. There's some division in the community, and he wants them to get together. And he uses the example of himself. He uses the example of Christ, who did not cling to his privileges, the famous Philippian hymn, but emptied himself, and even to the point of the cross. Therefore, you Philippians, you could do a little to get along with each other, to settle your differences. And when he comes to the beginning of chapter 4, he says, I urge Evodia and I urge Syntyche to come to a mutual understanding in the Lord. And then he asks two other people to help them. And I'm not alone on this, read it, that the whole letter, urging them to come together, is about a division that has happened between these two women, which means they're important women. And if you look at the very beginning of Philippians, it's Paul and Timothy, slaves of Christ Jesus, to all the holy ones in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with their episkopoi and diakonoi. Well translated here, overseers and ministers. Sometimes it's translated bishops and deacons, which is really anachronistic. We'll talk about that again next week. So this is the only letter that Paul writes to a people in a geographical region in which he names the titles of their leaders. He gives the titles of their leaders, which has to have meant that in the Philippian community, they were already pretty organized by the time he writes this letter. And one wonders why Evodia and Syntyche are mentioned by name toward the end of the letter. Could it be that they are among the leaders, the episkopoi and diakonoi, in the church at Philippi? To me, that's very plausible, and that the division is between the two of them. It has also been suggested that it's not between the two of them, it's the two of them against Paul. And that is also possible. But I think the more likely explanation is that we have two women who are important leaders, significant people, who are at odds with each other, which wouldn't be that unusual. In Romans 16, you have a whole series of name dropping that Paul does. And we have Phoebe, of course, which we're going to get to. In verse 6, Maria, Andronicus, and Junia. Andronicus is a man's name. Junia is a woman's name in verse 7. Tryphena, Tryphosa, and dear Persis in verse 12. The unnamed mother of Rufus, who he says is also my mother. Why he doesn't name her may have been one of those senior moments, when you just can't remember the name. And then there's a woman named Julia in verse 16, and the sister of Nereus and Olympus. So there are a number of women couched in a whole series of men's name as well in chapter 16 of Romans. One wonders how Paul knew so many people in Rome if he'd never been there, which leads to the suspicion on the part of some that chapter 16 was not originally part of Romans. It was meant to go to Ephesus, where it would make more sense for some of those people to be. Be that as it may, this, for us, for our purposes, that list is really significant in that there are so many women and a lot of men. There are more men than women. And that all of these people, and many of these people are called co-workers. Or people who have worked hard for the gospel. That can only mean evangelizing, giving hospitality to church meetings, that kind of thing. So let's look at Phoebe. And on the map on the left side, you see the placement of Corinth. And Phoebe does not live actually in Corinth, but in Kencray, which is about 6 miles away. And it is the seaport. It's the eastern seaport of Corinth. There's a northern seaport, Lechion, and the eastern seaport, Kencray. And if you look at the location of Corinth, you know how it got its wealth because of its placement there. To the north, you have the Gulf of Corinth and access to the west, to Italy, to Spain, to Carthage, every place. And from Kencray, you have access to the east, to everything in the east, Asia Minor and Egypt and everything to the east. So a very key location. In 1893, they finally finished a canal that's only, the isthmus is 4 miles, it's solid rock. The canal is only 70 feet wide. They tried in antiquity. Nero was one of the people who tried to build a canal. They were never able to do it. Instead, they had what they called the diolkos, which was a stone road on which they dragged ships from one side to the other, the 4 miles across. By putting logs in front of them, you continuously place logs and the ship rolls on it, pulled on ropes from the side, probably with mules or oxen. So Corinth made a lot of money on that. And the port from the north, the Lechion port, the picture on the left is the entry from Lechion, which was apparently a walled passageway that you can see in the map on the right. And the Kencray Road out of Corinth over on the east side, there's a picture of it too. That's never been excavated, and it goes off into a field, but about 6 miles away, you do have the port of Kencray, which is where Phoebe is from. A lot of the port is now underwater. You see in the picture on the left, the sketch of how much is underwater, but on the right, you see an aerial view. And so it was an important port. And today you see what it looks like today with a little bay there. So Phoebe, in 2 verses, we get a lot of information about her. I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a minister, a diakonos. We'll talk about that next week, of the church at Kencray, that to receive her in the Lord in a worthy manner, help her in whatever she may need of you, because she is a prostatis to many and to me as well. He's introducing Phoebe, and it's not unreasonable to speculate, therefore, that she's not only carrying the letter, but when she gets to Rome, she's going to be the reader of the letter. Reading these manuscripts was a special skill, and it was understood that you would read it and maybe interpret as you go. So it is not unreasonable to think that Phoebe herself was the one who did that when she brought Paul's letter to Rome, excuse me. But what is a prostatis? A benefactor, a patron is probably a better translation. So in order to understand that, I introduce you to another contemporary woman in Corinth named Junia Theodora, who's not Christian, not Jewish, anything like that. She's from Mysia in Asia Minor. You see that on the arrow on the right. It's above, just north of Lydia. We'd heard about Lydia from Philippi. And when she died, she's an immigrant to Corinth. And when she died, the grateful people from her place who were in Corinth erected this very large monument at her tomb. The entire thing is covered with writing. I don't know if you can see that. The entire thing, it's a very long text. that praises Junia Theodora for being prostatis for them. So what does she do for them, for the people from her country, her home place? When they come to Corinth, probably on business, she provides hospitality for them. She introduces them to the right people. She networks for them. She gets them set up in their startups. She does everything to help the people from her home place, which means she had to have a certain economic and social status. She's not an elite, but she is very well off and is able to do this kind of thing. So we can imagine that that's the kind of thing that Phoebe did for believers in Jesus. So when Paul goes to Corinth, he probably stays with her, probably did at the beginning, and she would set him up with situations in which he could evangelize, and situations in which he could exercise his trade, all of that kind of thing. So I think you get the idea. I also want to introduce you to one other person who's, and this is about women as heads of households, Emerita Quadratilla. She's a bit of a heroine to me. Pliny the Younger mentions her in one of his letters. She is running her own household in Casinum, and which is down the way from Rome, or no, I guess it's north. It's north, and the reason Pliny mentions her is that he does not approve of the way she's raising her grandson in her house. There's no mention of her marital status. She's probably a widow, a very wealthy widow, and she is a member of the Roman elite. He doesn't approve of the grandson being there because of the entertainment that she has at dinners. She brings in pantomime, and pantomimes who were, it was very popular. It was a very popular kind of entertainment, and of dubious respectability, so Emerita Quadratilla was clearly running her own household and deciding on her own what kind of dinner she was going to have and what kind of entertainment they were going to have. And I had known about her for a long time, and some years ago, I was at Monte Cassino at the Benedictine mother house, walking across the courtyard, and I couldn't believe it. There was this inscription about Emerita Quadratilla, and it says that she built the amphitheater and a temple in Casinum for the Cassinians out of her own money. So Emerita Quadratilla, go for it. A brief reference to Nympha in Colossians. Greet those who are in Laodicea, and also Nympha and the church that is in her house. And there are references to the church in the house of Prisca and Aquila, and some others. So we have a way to imagine that now, that people are meeting. Oh, there's so much that could be said about house churches. People are meeting they're receiving hospitality, and for the meeting, for the weekly meeting with the Eucharist and the preaching. But also we assume then that these people are giving hospitality to visitors like Paul, evangelizers, but also others who are on the move for other reasons, who are members of the way of the church. Something about Junia. Romans 16:7, greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives, or that can mean people from the same place, and my fellow prisoners. Fellow prisoners, we don't know anything about that. When were they prisoners together? They are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. They were believers in Christ before Paul. So these are people who have been around for a long time. One suggestion is that they are part of the 500, the mysterious 500 that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that the risen Christ appeared to 500 all at once. We have nothing else about what that is about. But they are prominent among the apostles, which can mean one of two things. It can mean the apostles know them well, but they're not among the apostles. Or it can mean they are among the apostles. They are members of the apostles. And we know of others. Paul references apostles in 2 Corinthians 8. Epaphroditus in Philippians, Paul calls an apostle. And Paul, of course, himself calls himself apostle. In Acts 14:4, 4:14, sorry. Paul and Barnabas is called an apostle. So there are others. There's the tradition of the 12, but there are others who are called apostles. So Andronicus and Junia could be among them. A couple, probably, the way they're talked of together. And John Chrysostom, in 4th century, in his commentary on Romans, says, what a wonderful woman this was that Paul calls her an apostle. So he clearly understands Andronicus and Junia to be apostles, to be members of the apostles. In the 13th century, one interpreter said, if this person is an apostle, can't be a woman, must be a man, and invented the name Junias, putting an S on the end of it, a name that is otherwise unattested. That is, we don't know of any other example of a man named Junius. But that has prevailed for centuries. And one of my tests of a translation, somebody puts a New Testament translation in my hands, and what do I think of it? I go right to Romans 16:7. Is this Junia or Junias? And if it's Junias, then it's taking that tack that this is not a woman. But Junia has been restored in most translations now. So we do have a woman here who's called an apostle, clearly. So to summarize, apostles, prophets, and teachers, all of them, there are women in all of these categories. And sometimes it's simply up to our imagination and up to our consciousness that all of these important positions in the early church are gender inclusive. The end. And I'm sorry that there won't be any way to entertain discussion this time, but I will see you next week. Thank you.